Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to objectively map out the claims made in a really highly charged, deeply complex piece of media. We're looking at a source that presents this massive, provocative narrative about global elites, and it's aiming to uncover what it calls the New World Order. Now, our goal here isn't to validate these claims or debunk them. Instead, we want to carefully structure and understand exactly what this source is arguing, how it builds its case, and what it claims is really going on behind the scenes of global power.
To do this, we'll just follow this visual roadmap. First, the rise of unelected power. Then we'll look at George Soros, Bill Gates, the World Economic Forum, and finally, the business of climate change. Let's get into it. So, the entire source material really hinges on this single, super provocative question. It asks us to look past our local ballots and our national parliaments. The overarching thesis here is that true global policy, the actual rules that dictate your health, your money, and your freedom, is drafted in private by a select group of financial titans and unelected organizations way before it ever reaches a public vote.
All right, Section 1, the rise of unelected power.
The source takes a really specific stance on the word globalization. Now, your standard economic textbook might define globalization simply as the growing interdependence of world economies and trade. Pretty harmless, right? But according to the source, true globalization is a lot darker. They define it as a coordinated push toward a centralized superstate. It argues that this movement is explicitly designed to strip independent nations of their autonomy, erase individual cultures, and centralize laws and currencies under a single, unelected authority.
Moving right along to Section 2, George Soros and his financial influence. The source material kicks off its profile on Soros with some incredibly severe historical allegations. Relying on an interview with a witness, the source claims that during the Nazi occupation of Budapest in 1944, Soros's family forged Christian identities just to survive. But it goes further, alleging that to maintain this cover, the family actively collaborated with the fascist Arrow Cross Party, actually helping to confiscate property from their fellow Jews. The source suggests that this alleged wartime profiteering formed the seed money that allowed a young Soros to escape to England with significant wealth in 1947. We're reporting these claims impartially here, just to show exactly how the source establishes its narrative of ruthless opportunism right from his childhood.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the source uses Soros's own words to characterize his modern financial mindset. By pulling this specific quote, the source attempts to draw a direct line from the alleged survival tactics of his youth straight to his philosophy as a hedge fund manager. It paints a picture of an individual operating entirely outside the boundaries of normal morality or national loyalty. From there, the source builds on this by detailing a two-pronged strategy it attributes to him. On the left side, we see what the source calls market destabilization, using massive offshore hedge funds to short national currencies, like the British pound or the Thai baht, generating billions in personal profit. But the crucial point the source makes is on the right. It argues that Soros takes these immense unregulated profits and just funnels them back into domestic political influence. Through his Open Society foundations, the source claims he funds progressive political campaigns, local district attorneys, and social justice organizations to deliberately dismantle traditional legal and economic systems from the inside out.
Which brings us to Section 3. Bill Gates, focusing on health and lands.
Take a look at this table. It perfectly illustrates a recurring narrative device used throughout the source material, contrasting public PR with alleged private motives. Where the rest of the world sees global philanthropy, the source sees a man literally buying a controlling stake in the World Health Organization. Where the public sees vaccine development, the source points to things like the Event 21 pandemic simulation, alleging Gates uses his wealth to dictate global health mandates. And where Gates promotes climate sustainability, the source highlights the hypocrisy of flying on private jets while telling the general public to eat synthetic meat and insects.
260,000. That is the number of acres of U.S. farmland Bill Gates currently owns, which actually makes him the largest private owner of farmland in the country. The source heavily emphasizes this number to argue that his agenda isn't just about healthcare at all. It's an alarming centralization of agricultural control. The source basically asks the viewer, why is a software billionaire quietly buying up the land that grows our food while simultaneously pushing laboratory alternatives? And the source doesn't stop there. It rapid-fires a few more claims to complete its mosaic of Bill Gates' influence. It cites his backing of the Common Core education standards as this top-down billionaire experiment that totally bypassed actual educators. It notes his hundreds of millions of dollars in funding to global media outlets, which the source claims basically buys him immunity from journalistic criticism. And it highlights his past meetings with convicted criminal Jeffrey Epstein to cast doubt on his moral compass. Altogether, the source uses these points to argue that Gates holds unelected, completely unchecked influence over education, news, food, and health.
All right, Section 4, the WEF and globalism. The source tracks the WEF's evolution to show exactly how it allegedly bypassed democratic systems. It started simply enough in 1971 as a European business conference. But over the decades, the source argues, it transformed into a massive global policy engine. By launching initiatives in the 90s and 2000s, it began molding future leaders. The timeline ends in 2024, highlighting recent whistleblower allegations of mismanagement and extravagant spending that led to Klaus Schwab stepping down, which the source presents as the very first cracks in an otherwise flawless elite machine.
A major focal point for the source is the WEF's Young Global Leaders program. I mean, just look at this list of alumni. Justin Trudeau, Emmanuel Macron, Mark Zuckerberg. The source explicitly claims that these are not just graduates, but actual assets. The argument here is that the WEF identifies rising stars early, trains them in Davos, and when global crises hit, these leaders respond in almost identical ways, using identical language to push a totally synchronized global governance framework. So, how does this unelected body actually enforce its will? Well, the source details some specific mechanisms. It claims the WEF pushes for borderless supply chains, which it directly blames for the collapse of American manufacturing. It highlights the promotion of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, scoring, arguing this is just a tool to force corporations to comply with progressive ideologies or risk losing their banking access altogether. And it points to digital IDs and coordinated pandemic lockdowns as proof of a centralized playbook designed to manage populations rather than serve them. And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, the business of climate change. The source first sets the stage with the public narrative using this quote from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez regarding the Green New Deal. The mainstream message is one of economic salvation, the idea that tackling the climate crisis through government policy is going to create millions of well-paying jobs and lead us to a utopian clean energy future. And this brilliantly illustrates how the source immediately counters that public narrative, claiming the reality on the ground is entirely different. It points to over 40,000 lost coal jobs and shuttered refineries, arguing the new green jobs are mostly just temporary or subsidized illusions. It claims that carbon taxes simply punish the working class at the gas pump, while Wall Street banks invent a shiny new, highly profitable market trading invisible carbon credits. The source also attacks the environmental validity of green tech itself, pointing to toxic lithium mining and massive unrecyclable wind turbine blades, basically concluding that net zero is just a clever accounting trick allowing elites to keep polluting while everyone else sacrifices.
To really hammer this point home, the explainer points the spotlight at Al Gore. On the left, we've got his 2006 documentary warning of imminent planetary doom, which completely set off global panic. But on the right, the source points out that Gore co-founded a sustainable investment firm 2 years prior, in 2004. The source uses this timeline to argue that the climate crisis was intentionally transformed from a scientific discussion into a multi-billion-dollar economy where the cost of pollution became the elite's profit.
Ultimately, the source brings its entire argument toward a resolution with the message of populist backlash. It claims that the public is finally starting to see the strings being pulled. The source argues that across the world, everyday citizens are waking up and rejecting ESG mandates, fighting back against digital censorship, and turning completely away from Davos-aligned politicians. According to the narrative we're analyzing, the elite system relied on the public not paying attention. And that era of blind obedience, it's over. Which leaves us with this final, overarching thought from the source material. We've mapped out how this media claims billionaires, private forums, and global policies intertwine to completely bypass democracy. But if the rules that govern your life, your food, and your economy are truly being drafted in private ski resorts by unelected figures, who exactly holds them accountable? It's a wildly provocative question, and it's the one the source uses to challenge its viewers to look very closely at the power structures all around them. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep asking questions and keep learning.